Hey, was Final Fantasy XVI bad? Is the Final Fantasy series going through an identity crisis? Core. These are big questions, and they have big answers. Just look at the scrub bar on this video. But I will answer them, that I promise you.
Well, there's nothing to say that hasn't already been said. But that's never stopped me before.
Final Fantasy XVI is the boldly numbered latest installment in the long-running series. Kind of. Publisher Square Enix still believes in console exclusivity, at least to a point, so despite the game's original release in summer of last year, I wasn't able to touch it until now. Now I've touched it. I've touched it all over. I've touched it thoroughly and analytically. The general vibe I get from people online is that Final Fantasy XVI was, generally speaking, unremarkable. Despite looking beautiful and holding an 87 on Metacritic, Final Fantasy XVI feels like a game that came and went. This is probably not helped by the fact that Square has published two major things what say Final Fantasy on the box in the scant 15 months between the original PlayStation 5 release and the game now coming out on PC. Were I a Square Enix executive, would I reconsider my release calendar based on brand strength and exposure? Of course I would, but I'm not, so here we are. Even though other people have moved on to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail, I'm playing Final Fantasy XVI on Steam. And I have some pretty strong opinions about it. Opinions that largely and respectfully disagree with the general consensus on this one. I'm not coming in with hot takes or whatever, but I did play it and I liked it, and I'd like to talk to you about why that is and what the game does that's special. Final Fantasy XVI is a lot of things. Like I already mentioned, it's the technically latest release in a storied franchise. The fact is, the name Final Fantasy carries a lot of weight when you stick a Roman numeral after it. Sometimes I feel that the game-playing public is a little too preoccupied by this. Differences from games we've played before are far more tolerable if we consider them extraneous to some sort of central piece that makes up the foundations of what that property is. Online, you can see this thinking so commonly that it's presented in shorthand when people refer to what is or isn't a mainline game in a series. For example, what is considered a mainline Mario game versus a Mario spin-off is typically pretty clear. It all comes down to how the game is presented, from its title to its development schedule. Something like Mario Tennis Aces doesn't get the resources, be they financial or chronological, that something like Super Mario Odyssey receives. The game-liking populace enjoys this kind of nomenclature so much that they will argue over the validity of a piece based on these factors. I bring all of this up because Final Fantasy XVI, for reasons somewhat beyond my ken, is a poster child for franchises that are directionless or confused. Recently, Final Fantasy XVI and its contemporary Final Fantasy VII Rebirth were the central subjects of an analytical piece on GamesIndustry.biz. The piece, entitled Final Fantasy's Sales Crisis is Also an Identity Crisis, is largely focused on the economic realities of how those games have sold thus far and how Square Enix has reacted to their lofty expectations remaining unmet by their own franchises. Now, first and foremost, I want to thank the writer for writing the piece and GamesIndustry.biz for running it. The article raises some super valid points about the economic side of examining Final Fantasy XVI, which I'm not arguing with here in the slightest. Truly, the only piece I want to speak to directly is this central paragraph. Games like FF15 and FF16 are almost entirely divorced from the legacy of the series and the expectations of existing fans, tied to the franchise only by a shallow application of window dressing in the form of a few visual and naming elements. The chasing of new genres and the peculiar sense that the company is actually somewhat ashamed of its prize IP being a JRPG has left this series without a firm footing in its own past. This is the piece of the article that I think speaks most directly to the identity crisis part of the title. Respectfully, and I do mean that, I disagree that there's an identity crisis at all. I think that Final Fantasy XVI is as much a Final Fantasy game as 15 is, or 14 is, or 4 is. What I mean is that from a storytelling perspective, Final Fantasy XVI is as Final Fantasy has ever been. Final Fantasy. we're going to spend some time talking about how that can possibly be true. We're also going to get into the narrative structure of Final Fantasy XVI as a piece, and how its presentation does and doesn't serve its best qualities. By the end, we'll have evaluated Final Fantasy XVI as a story, and not as a video game. I know that can sound a little intimidating, but bear with me. I think you'll find this interesting. Maybe even learn a thing or two. Who knows? Final Fantasy XVI is a story of duos. Its logo displays, in Yoshitaka Amano's trademark style, this very idea. Ifrit and the Phoenix, both plot-relevant and massive creatures, appear to be dueling over the classic font-centric logo the series has maintained since the beginning. The world of the game is split across two continents, Storm and Ash, and that separation plays into the overarching political story that helps define the larger world of the game and provide a through line for the plot to come. But even sweeping aside all of that thematic pairing, there's a truth about the story of FF16 that's tied to this idea. Largely, Final Fantasy XVI is two stories. There's the story presented in the first, let's be generous and say, 15-ish hours, and then there's the story presented throughout the rest of the game. If you step back from FF16 and charted its story like some kind of crazy person, you'd have something akin to a duology of novels. I have invented titles for these two sections so that we may more clearly mark their progression and understand how they differ. The first 15 hours of the game is what we'll call Lord of the Wings, and tells a very specific story about central protagonist Clive Rosfield. We see his origins, the events that set his mission apace, and the first steps he takes into a larger destiny. The second part, picking up 5 years afterward, we'll call A Song of Anime and Fire. This is the portion of the game where things snowball into a much larger, wider narrative and begin to have more of an impact on the greater fictional world of Valisthea. Final Fantasy has, since the beginning, been a game about parties. Even games with inarguable central protagonists, like 7 for example, still have ensembles that the player manages, if not outright controls. Once upon a time, it was the story of characters you named going on a quest to save the world. Now, it's the story of a very defined character's growth, trauma, and healing. That might feel disruptive, especially when it is paired with gameplay that is strayed from the turn-based RPG experience that is almost synonymous with the series. Though, I hate to break it to you, but Final Fantasy hasn't had turn-based combat in 8 to 11 years, depending on your metric. That's like a third of my life, so these are kinda action games now. In fact, while I would argue FF16 is most certainly a Final Fantasy, I'd also argue against it being classified as an RPG, but the nomenclature surrounding role-playing games is a topic for another day. But first, hi, I'm David Cole, a writer from Kentucky. Real quick, if you enjoyed the video you're about to see, consider liking it or commenting below. Every little bit helps. If you really like it, then please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications to catch new content when it comes out. Finally, if you enjoy how I'm talking about and covering video games, consider checking out my Patreon and supporting the work that way. You'll receive bonus content and credit in videos just like this one for your trouble. Thank you. Now, let's begin at the beginning. A very good place to start. Lord of the Wings. The story of Final Fantasy XVI is split across 3 time periods, each following Clive at a different point in his life. Lord of the Wings largely encompasses the first 2 of these sections, despite its shorter runtime. The gist we're presented with early on is that in the world of Valisthea, magic is something you're either born with or you're not. Those who are, called bearers in the fiction, are able to channel magic through crystals to accomplish tasks. Some bearers are able to use their magic without a crystal, but this practice takes a toll on their bodies that can progress so far as seeing them grow sick and turning to ash. The crystals themselves come from 4 mother crystals, which are giant artifacts spread across the world and protected by the nations that house them. These are, obviously, the stand-ins for the central crystals of Final Fantasy's past. The narrative takes an interesting turn in regard to these, but we'll save that for the second story. The first story starts in Rosaria, a duchy that does not house a mother crystal of its own, but does have a special power. You see, there are a handful of people throughout the world with the ability to, essentially, transform into embodiments of the elements. These creatures are called Eikons, and the people who can turn into them are referred to as dominants. I know there's a lot of potential for humor there, but I'll try to keep it to a minimum. Rosaria has long been the home of a royal line that has included dominance of an icon called the Phoenix, naturally associated with fire. Rulers of Rosaria are either the dominant themselves or people warming the throne until the next dominant is born. Our hero Clive is the firstborn son of the Duke of Rosaria, but he was not born as the dominant of the Phoenix. That honor goes to his precious younger brother Joshua, who is best described as the sort of boy who would sit around and look pensively into a well. The relationship between Clive and Joshua, as well as Clive and the rest of the royal retinue, is the focus of the earliest chronological pieces of the narrative. Joshua is sickly and frail, but he is undoubtedly the dominant. Clive is protective of his younger brother and harbors no jealousy or envy because of his abilities. Rather, Clive works to become Rosaria's most capable knight, so that he may serve as Joshua's personal bodyguard, or shield. Clive's relationship with his parents is a little more complicated. Hey, who's that not true about? His father gets along well enough. The Duke has a respect for his eldest son, having been born without being a dominant himself. Though we don't get a ton of screen time with the Duke, you can tell from both the body language and contexts of scenes in which he interacts directly with his sons that he has a favorite. It's subtle, probably out of necessity, but the story tells us directly, on several occasions, how much Clive has in common with his father. His mother is a different story. The Lady Annabella is a scheming, conniving witch of a woman from the outset. At no point does her character show a shred of a redeemable quality. Early on, we witness this through her distaste for Clive, seeing him as a failure for not being born as a dominant. This is something she is not afraid to point out, even at the least appropriate of times.
Unlike some, you have not disgraced our noble blood.
Without men like Clive to keep us safe, your precious noble blood would long since have graced the gutter.
I'll tell you now that Annabella is not a complex character. She remains relevant to the plot well into A Song of Anime and Fire, but largely inhabits the role of the wicked stepmother, if you will. In some ways, she is the central antagonist of Lord of the Wings. Her betrayal of Rosaria that closes out the first section of the game is the incident which, more than any other, sets Clive's journey in motion. Early on, I thought there was a lot of potential for Annabella as a character, but as the game continues, the possibility of this happening or getting much expansion grew slimmer and slimmer until, well, despite the lack of overall development of her character, I like her. She's very Cersei, if you know what I mean. Her schemes are largely motivated by political aspirations, particularly regarding the position of her son. At first, this is Joshua, who will eventually become the Duke of Rosaria. Later, it is Olivier, who will become emperor of a different nation. It's easy to sit back and say that Annabella's goal is simple. She wants her child to become something great, to leave a huge mark on the world. She wants it so badly that she schemes to conceive another child in another larger political position once it becomes clear that Joshua may not survive to become Duke. She accepts this as an inevitability and essentially plots to hasten the boy's demise so she may proceed to produce another heir elsewhere. As players, we aren't afforded much of an opportunity to sympathize with the Lady Annabella, but she is an example of how the narrative is framed and one that cannot be ignored. Final Fantasy XVI is clearly inspired by Game of Thrones. I've made that point already, and it will continue to come up indirectly, but that isn't the only material that lends its threads to the FF16 tapestry. What I'm about to say is something that will make somebody roll their eyes, and you know, fair enough, but I do feel it genuinely, so I'm going to do it. Final Fantasy XVI is Shakespearean. I am cringe, but I am free. I mean Shakespearean both as a strength and a weakness. On the one hand, FF16 uses its protagonist as a way to tell a personal story at the heart of a much larger story. We follow Clive through virtually everything that occurs, but his personal story is only a part of a whole. Valisthea, the world itself, is dying. A blight is spreading throughout the land and robbing it of the life that sustains it. Greenery, turns gray. The people living in affected areas become sickly. Monsters move in greater numbers. All apocalyptic events. And, for most of the story, this isn't a huge concern for our hero. He sets out on a mission of vengeance that eventually becomes a quest to change the world itself. But his aims are less about the practical impossibilities presented by the dying land and more about the suffrage of bearers. We'll touch on this more in A Song of Anime and Fire. But it is in Lord of the Wings where the echoes of the bard are clearest. Coincidentally, it is Lord of the Wings that serves as the stronger of the two narratives presented in Final Fantasy XVI. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back and examine the contained narrative of the story's first part. Clive is the firstborn son of Rosaria's Duke. His destiny is to protect and serve his younger brother, who will one day lead the nation as the dominant of the Phoenix. Clive's life has been largely contained to the relatively small duchy itself. At the story's beginning, he's only 15 years old. He has experienced no small amount of hardship despite his status. Most of it stems from the treatment he receives from his mother, and by extension, the attitude of the greater court toward him as a result of his normalcy. Though most treat Clive with respect, even adoration when it comes to some of the soldiers, there is a protocol that must be observed in his personal life that would be difficult for anyone. He has to call his father my lord and bend the knee in official audiences, something the Duke implies is done because of his mother, but this isn't necessarily the full truth of it. In my reading, Clive is an uncomfortable young man who only gets to be himself with a select group of people. In this group, he only gets to be around without the pressures of courtly etiquette on occasion. The composition of this group, however, doesn't afford him the luxury of being vulnerable. The people he can let down any amount of his guard around are his younger brother Joshua, a ward of the duchy named Jill, and his pet wolf Torgal. Despite the fact that these are all adolescents, Joshua and Jill feel more like children, whereas Clive is a teen. He's still relegated to sitting at the kids' table, if you will. Though he may get to be more of himself around this select grouping, he also has to fulfill the role of elder brother. He can't rightly express the frustrations his position puts upon him, or the emotions he has regarding the treatment afforded him by his mother, as he is most commonly a support structure for both Joshua and Jill. Though it is clear from their expressions and cutscenes that they understand the difficulty this poses on him, there is still this barrier that prevents Clive from being a child himself. If I had to guess, I'd say Clive never really got to be a child. From the moment it was clear he would not be the dominant of the Phoenix, I think Clive was relegated to this position of being just a member of the court, rather than a true part of the royal family. This works in his favor as a protagonist, giving him a believable reason to feel and act less like nobility. He's uncomfortable when deference is shown toward him, as we see early on in this scene, where we are first introduced to the social status of bearers.
Good as new. Forgive me, Lord Marquess, pray do not concern yourself with this bungling cur. Bow to him, you fool. Did I say to speak? It was no trouble. Really.
He's kind. He's naive. Hung up as he is on big, vague ideals like duty and honor, his world is tremendously small. And that's not even getting into how Rosaria itself is perhaps the smallest nation-state on Valisthea. Clive's an easy protagonist to feel some kind of empathy for early on, and in my playthrough, he maintained it throughout the game's plot, even after points where the central narrative dragged. More on that later, too. This is partially because of how phenomenally he is performed by Ben Starr, who brings to Clive both a boyish innocence and a haggard quality that only increases as the character ages.
Find him. You've done this before. You can do it again. Let the flames burn within you. No. Let them burn without. Come to me, Ifrit!
As a side note here, Final Fantasy XVI is one of the best acted games I've experienced in quite some time. I don't think there was a single performance that stood out to me as being noticeably less invested or informed than most others. Susanna Fielding gives more depth to Jill than the writing does. Ralph Ineson makes Sid sound like he's at least part chimney, and I mean that as both a comment on the smokiness and warmth of his performance. Christina Cole makes Annabella the Lady Macbeth she comes across as. Christopher York pushes Gav into the realm of the series' best sidekicks. And Stephen Critchlow's performance as Byron Rosfield is, I am convinced, what makes him my favorite character of an extensive cast. Honestly, if I could give proper dues to all the notable performances in the game, we'd have to go through virtually the entire cast. Where Final Fantasy XVI suffers in its writing, it more than makes up for in the performances that bring that writing to life. Back to that writing. Lord of the Wings comes to a head when Clive and Joshua travel with their father and a contingent of Rosarian knights to a place called Phoenix Gate. You see, winter is coming. War is coming. When war were declared, Rosarian nobility perform a special ritual at Phoenix Gate to, presumably, be blessed by the Phoenix. Since Joshua, by all accounts, is the Phoenix, it's pretty critical that this small boy be there. It is at Phoenix Gate that we begin to understand the complexity of the relationship between the three men of the house. The Duke is not necessarily distant with Joshua, but the rapport he shares with Clive is not present with his younger son. Conversely, Joshua isn't the boy he is around Clive when he's around his father, instead adhering to his own sort of protocol. One could imagine, quite easily, that this is a result of how Annabella treats the boys, but again, this isn't something that's spelled out one way or the other. As is tradition, the comfortably lit and festive events of the evening quickly turn to slaughter. Agents of the Holy Empire of Sambrek, a much larger nation, invade Phoenix Gate and begin killing the knights. The Rosfield men find each other in the chaos and plans are made to spirit Joshua and the Duke away, while Clive and the remaining knights defend the gate. This doesn't work out, and the Duke finds himself in Ned Stark's shoes in more ways than one. Joshua, witnessing his father's brutal murder with the eyes of a 10-year-old boy, he kind of loses it. This sparks his transformation for the first time into the Phoenix. That's right. Just like Goku watching Krillin pop like a meat balloon, Joshua unlocks his potential through the emotional upheaval of a loved one's death. Remember what I said before. Final Fantasy XVI borrows heavily from Game of Thrones and Shakespeare specifically. You can legitimately add Dragon Ball Z to that list. This will become a little more obvious later, but for now, just make a note of it. The transformation of a dominant into their Eikon is not a small thing. It is not a flat power-up that changes their shape. Eikons are gigantic beasts and conduits for powerful magic besides. When Joshua transforms into the Phoenix, the fire that pours from his changing body literally incinerates the people around him. This includes the knights most directly responsible for his father's death and his father's corpse, reduced to ash in seconds because of the transformation. The way that the act of becoming one's Eikon is represented here makes the process come across as impactful just through its occurrence. And frankly, I'm all for it. It sells the drama of the moment. And then Joshua, now a giant firebird, goes on a bit of a rampage. I know that sounds silly, and on paper it kinda is, but the thing about Final Fantasy XVI that I think makes it kind of exceptional is how it weaves some of the absurdity of shonen anime into the type of drama one encounters in serious fantasy fiction. It comes across as absurd, yes, but not out of place. That's a fine line to walk, and one easily tripped in favor of tumbling too far into one direction. But even during the story's most ridiculous visuals, naturally near the end, I didn't feel at any point what was happening was silly. Because of how the game was selling itself to me with a strong cast and varied writing, I genuinely bought into this concept of transformations and monster fights. To Clive, this is not silly at all. He is in a situation where men sworn to protect his country and family are dying left and right, and he has no real understanding of why this is happening. On top of that, a giant firebird has just appeared, which tells him two things. One, a giant firebird, and two, Joshua is a giant firebird. Both are equally concerning, I argue. And then something happened. Clive sees a fiery figure. It looks at him with intent, and then he erupts into a pillar of flame. When it clears, another creature is standing tall, Ifrit. A minor character informs us that this is a second icon of fire, and that this sort of thing has never happened before. What follows is an incredibly lavish fight scene between the two out-of-control icons. Joshua seems to gain control over the Phoenix, and quickly too, but Clive doesn't even realize he is Ifrit, let alone the ability to control what the icon does. The fight ends with this brutal beatdown where Ifrit has the Phoenix pinned to the ground and begins relentlessly attacking it. All the while, Clive is shouting out, "Powerless! to stop the violence against his brother. From his perspective, it all appears to be in front of him. He sees himself as a bystander, helpless before the might of these colossi in battle. The confusion of this moment is communicated to us via camera positions, alternating between third and first person as the assault continues. All the while, Clive's most heart-wrenching vocal performance is playing out. The pain in his voice is so evident as he witnesses this demolishing of essentially his entire world.
Murderer. I'll kill you! I'll fucking kill you!
It's fucking beautiful. The way this part of the game plays with dramatic irony is interesting. We see the fire person appear to Clive before Ifrit enters the fray. It isn't difficult for a player to deduce that Clive is, in fact, Ifrit. But the truth of this remains unclear to Clive, who will leave Phoenix Gate on a mission of vengeance to find this mysterious figure he believes became the Eikon. So, you know he's Ifrit, I know he's Ifrit, the game developers know we know he's Ifrit, but again, Clive doesn't. This is the centerpiece of Lord of the Wings. Clive killed his brother and is unable to believe it even possible. We can assume, probably safely, that this will come up again. And it will, in time. But first, the seeds of a song of anime and fire must be planted. There's a time skip at this point, the first of two. We see Clive 13 years later, at age 28, forced to serve the very empire that destroyed his life and his country. Clive's body is recovered from the ruins of Phoenix Gate, and he is pressed into service, given a brand that denotes him as a bearer to any and all he encounters. Removal of the brand results in death because of some sort of poison or something, explaining why powerful people with magic couldn't just escape their overseers and burn off the flesh. Clive is on a mission with an elite team of killers, tasked with the assassination of the dominant of Shiva. When his crew finds this dominant, however, he discovers it to be Jill, the first time he has seen his childhood friend and confidant in over a decade. Clive protects her, turning against the other assassins, and sets into motion a series of events that sees him discovering a community of freebearers, working closely with the leader of that community, a man named Sid, and hearing rumors of a supposed second dominant of fire being spotted afield. Jill is complicated. We'll get back to that too, trust me. For now, Sid takes Clive under his wing and introduces him to his hideaway, a place where bearers are able to live lives not defined by their brand. Some have even managed to have the brand removed. This part of the story is where the narrative hooks for a song of anime and fire start to sink in. That section of the game will focus far more on the plight of the bearers, the state of the blight, and the remaining dominants. Clive is largely introduced to this way of life by Sid, who has a charming rogue rating of at least 3 Han Solos. But he isn't really convinced that it all has much of anything to do with him. After all, he's hunting down Ifrit. Sid brings Clive along to investigate scout reports of a hooded man who some have called a dominant of fire. This much Clive is up for. They quickly learn that they aren't the only people looking for this mystery man, however. A woman named Benedicta is chasing him for another global power, the kingdom of Waloed. It just so happens that Benedicta is the dominant of Garuda, and that she knows Sid, and that Sid is the dominant of Ramu. This is where the dominant thing feels silliest in the overarching plot, as it just so happens all of these super powerful people will cross paths directly without planning it. The narrative of A Song of Anime and Fire arguably reconciles all of these coincidences as machinations of an even bigger, dumber evil, but as you're going through the game on an initial playthrough, that information is hours and hours away. Dominants quickly feel not very special, to be as special as they are. For reference, there are less than 10 of them in the entire world, but our story has involved no less than half within these first 15 hours. It's pacing that could be considered slow for an action game, but it's downright bullshit blazing fast for a JRPG. Now, I'm no size queen, alright? I prefer a game to be more contained and captivating than I do long enough to justify its price. Check out You Should Play Elden Ring for more on that, true believers. But pacing is not Final Fantasy XVI's strong suit. Information will come hard and fast, then be broken up by much smaller world-building moments, and then you'll do some quests that sure feel like side quests before you get to the next action stage. Structurally, the actual quest design in Final Fantasy XVI is almost identical identical to the design in Final Fantasy XIV. The narrative lulls you into moments of comfort or boredom before coming back in with the next bit of bombast. Sometimes this is done well. Other times, let's just say that Mid is the most appropriately named character in the central plotline, and leave it at that. Conflict ensues. They fight. Alarum! Benedicta transforms into Garuda. Clive fights this giant bird woman on foot and manages to hold his own for an impressive amount of time. However, reality catches up to him and he undergoes his first transformation since the one at Phoenix Gate. He becomes Ifrit. Fight continues, Ifrit defeats Garuda, Clive isn't really in control of the Eikon, Cid steps in and stops him. What's important here is that this is when Clive learns that he is Ifrit. And critically, he learns that he is the one who killed Joshua. There was no other person who became the Eikon. Whatever he saw, whomever he saw, is not what became the Eikon. Clive became Ifrit. Clive destroyed Phoenix Gate. Clive murdered his brother. He takes this about as well as you would expect.
I'm a monster! And I deserve to die! So end it! End it now! Please! Please! Ah!
If I had a nickel for every time I've cried naked in a dungeon, well, it's weird that it's happened twice. It is this realization that anchors the first narrative arc of the game. From here, Clive's journey is pushed along by his attempts to help Cid in his quest to create a new place for bearers in society. He'll also have to come to terms with the reality that he has killed his brother. Kind of a big deal. The pacing of him coming to terms with this is drastically different depending on whether or not you enjoy side content. It doesn't take long for the primary story to place Clive in a situation where he must visualize and accept his role as Ifrit. It's a vision quest sort of thing in an ancient ruin. Through a combat scenario with a Dark Link version of himself, Clive can actually face his inner demons quite quickly. The scene here is phenomenal, and I believe a wonderful finale for this first section of the game. Though a little story remains before the second time skip, what's left is largely a prelude where information about what matters in the game's second half is presented. But you can sit with Clive's uncertainty for a while if you are the sort of person who likes to do side content in your games. A song of anime and fire. Hey, we made it to the second half of the game. Thus far, we have followed our hero's journey through trauma and acceptance. Perhaps even witnessed the first steps on what has to be a much longer journey of healing. But that doesn't really sound like a JRPG, does it?
No. We have a god to kill.
Oh, yep. There we go. There's a lot of lore to Final Fantasy XVI. The setting is perhaps one of the most detailed ones the series has produced, with the ones beating it out also having the benefit of multiple releases expanding upon those settings. Valisthea is a fascinating world, and I don't think it's absurd to say that I hope the setting gets more attention in future spin-offs or whatever. But the general thrust of the story here changes entirely once we reach this point in the game. It morphs from a character drama with an ensemble cast into a world-defining conflict exploring the consequences of an uncaring god. On the one hand, it's nice that we go into something like that following a protagonist we've had ample opportunity to like. On the other, halfway, it's a little late to introduce that concept. The real reason that this video is split up the way it is that once Clive has accepted what he's done, it quickly turns into the Ultima story. Ultima is God. Ultima is a god that has largely been absent from human history, but has decided now is the time to reclaim what was once theirs. Ultima looks like a freak and can change their shape at will. Ultima is, ultimately, alien to Valisthea and everything we're familiar with from the setting. It's also this part of the video that summarizes the game far less and explores more of the big ideas put forward by this story as a whole. If we tried to go through the major beats as in Lord of the Wings, there would be so much explanation necessary that it would be maddening for both of us, believe me. Rather than reciting lore at you, I think we can appropriately examine this part of Final Fantasy XVI through a more traditional essay format. So, here are 3 elements that make up this part of the narrative. As we go, you'll see why this section is titled like it is. Jill. I said it earlier, but it bears repeating. Jill is complicated. Jill has a role as a fairly constant party member throughout the game. During that time, time, she gets her own arc, coming face to face with the people who essentially enslaved her to utilize her abilities as a dominant for political gain. The leader of those people is her own father, whom she was taken from at an early age to be raised as a ward of the Rosarian Duchy. All sounds really interesting, right? Well, it is, and it's also quite brief. Jill starts as this well-defined character, and her storyline of overcoming her own trauma alongside Clive cements her as one of the better party members in all of Final Fantasy. Come at me. But her story also kind of stops once that's done. Afterwards, she's essentially a prop for Clive's development. Don't get me wrong, I adore the romance between Clive and Jill. I like that they're allowed to actually explore that angle, and the way they do it through two broken people slowly becoming more intimate with one another is well-paced and, more importantly, earned. But Jill herself feels like she sort of, forgive me, freezes once her arc concludes. She gets to achieve victory over her cruel and uncaring father, and then she gets to be in love with Clive from there. Her presence is critical to Clive's own healing, and the scenes featuring the two of them in private are expertly crafted and placed. However, I feel that her narrative is too compact. I don't think the answer was necessarily elongating it, or at least not by much, but I do think it needed more seeding throughout the story as a whole. For instance, it isn't really clear in the earliest part of the story that Jill is actually from the Iron Kingdom and not Rosarian, or even a member of Clive's family. I think it would have made sense to, at some point, have a conversation between Jill and Clive where they compare the way they are treated by their father and mother, respectively. I think you could place this before or after the first time skip, though the context of the conversation would be dramatically different depending on that choice. I also think that Jill's very overt coming to terms with her abuse story, clearly meant to mirror Clive's own, comes and goes far too quickly. We set out on a quest to the Iron Kingdom, and by the time we get back, Jill has settled a significant hurt inside of herself. She kills her evil dad and doesn't really have a lot to say about it afterwards, which I think is a real missed opportunity. Jill, in general, is sort of a missed opportunity. I think she succeeds if we consider her a side character, but that's not how she's presented. She's basically the secondary protagonist, the most consistent party member in a game without too many of those to begin with, and her outfit is literally designed to complement Clive's. She's presented as the driving female force in the narrative, but ultimately doesn't have enough to do to justify that. Again, I think this is a consequence of the rushed delivery of her story more than the content of it. As it is, she doesn't feel all that much more developed than Annabella, but the two of them do not have comparable screen time. It is what it is, I guess. I just can't help but feel it could have been better without much besides pacing adjustments. Anyway. Eikons. Eikons are big, really big. There aren't very many of them, and each is unique. Only one person can become the Phoenix, only one person can become Garuda, and so on. The implication is that these blessings are hereditary, and as a result, they have largely become centerpieces in noble houses throughout Valisthea. Political powers rely upon the dominance they have. Keep in mind that this doesn't stop the different cultures from treating them differently. The Iron Kingdom kept Jill as a weapon, essentially, wheeling her out when it was time for battle. But the dominant of Bahamut is the Prince of Sanbreque. The Duke of Rosaria has occasionally been the dominant of the Phoenix, and in Waloed, dominants occupy multiple governmental positions: Spy Master, Lord Commander, and King. No country treats their dominants quite the same way, and that's great. It allows us to see, through a central piece of our primary protagonist story, that the cultures between these larger powers are different. It's information one can't really ignore, but it isn't said directly to you. I think that makes it pretty well communicated as far as storytelling goes. I mean, in real life, you should always spell things out with your dominant, but that was my one. I allowed myself one in the entire script, and that was it. That was the one. Within the story, special people can transform into giant representations of meaningful figures from Final Fantasy's history. At times they have been called summons, at times they have been called icons, once they were even called primals, but it's the big creatures that you have probably fought or witnessed in some form if you've ever played a Final Fantasy before. Bahamut, Leviathan, Shiva, those guys. Mythological figures, right? Sometimes the plot requires two people who can make this transformation to clash, and what follows is a shonen anime fight. Like, to a T, there are explosions, beam struggles, short but resonant dialogue about overcoming your limits. Fuck. All the hits. It feels weird because this is the same game that will sometimes give you a mandatory lesson in the overarching political discourse throughout the realm, delivered via the age-old medium of looking at map. But then, like 2 hours later, you're running through a canyon, shooting down meteors with fireballs, dodging sudden changes in the landscape, and eyeballing a titanic foe. Kind of like the end of Sonic Adventure, only, well, in all honesty, that one just is the ending of Sonic Adventure. Point is, it's fun, it's hype, it gets your blood pumping and your fingers ready to do the thing when you push buttons meaningfully. It's also where all the pomp and circumstance is centered. And these fights are showcases for the graphical capabilities of whatever you're playing on. Something Square has always been ready to push as hard as they can, even when it's not been a great idea. They're also exercises in choreography, mixing interactivity and cinematics into fulfilling encounters that leave you ready to pop off when you finally hear the sound of victory, which is a choir of dudes chanting the classic victory theme's first few notes. You know the one. That one. None of these fights just happen for the sake of it, though. They aren't egregious in their necessity, only in their presentation. The music during these parts can be significantly different from the rest of the score. Do or Die might be my favorite track, and it isn't like anything else. Just listen for a second. Like, dude, that goes hard. Each one features dialogue, believe it or not. I guess Eikons can communicate telepathically, at least with each other, maybe? I don't know. But this is where the Dragon Ball Z storytelling I mentioned earlier comes in. It's kind of like, imagine you're at Shakespeare in the Park, and you're watching Macbeth, right? You're in the home stretch, and the fight's coming up. You know the one. Turn, hellhound, turn. Fight. Alarum. But then, instead of two guys in their 40s doing their best sword choreography, one of them turns into Godzilla, the other into Jet Jaguar, and then they just start shooting kamehamehas at each other. To some people, boring people, this would be a disruption of the storytelling. The sword fight at the end of Macbeth is an excellent opportunity to display character via choreography, and the intention is to do so. However, is it not thrilling to imagine how one could still do that in a bombastic way? That is what Final Fantasy XVI does. Were I here to criticize the gameplay, I'd probably say these segments are overly cinematic, giving you just as much to watch, or more, than to do. But I'm not. I'm here to talk about the story and its effectiveness. In that arena, these fights are great. Dragon Ball is a resonant piece of fiction because what it accomplishes is a distillation of an entire culture's idea of what a combat-centric story can be. There isn't a gimmick to it, really. It's pretty much just the characters have to find ways to increase their strength because a villain has appeared who is stronger than the last one. Other works have taken this conceit and twisted it or built on top of it to deliver something altogether different. Dragon Ball, however, is kind of the shonen. It's literally fighting, punching and kicking, with the experimentation coming in the form of representations of energy. Someone wins, someone loses, everyone has something to say. When crafting a fight scene, there's a line you walk between conveying the narrative point of the fight convincingly and producing a fight that's entertaining to watch. These are essentially two different disciplines. Dragon Ball's author, Akira Toriyama, is one of many Japanese artists who built a career out of walking that line. It's hard for me to say who is most directly responsible for the crafting of Final Fantasy XVI's bombastic icon fights, but I think it's safe to say that multiple people were involved. All of them did a great job. These fights are climaxes for chapters of FF16's ongoing story, and each is somehow larger than the last. Stakes continue to escalate convincingly. If we're talking about storytelling, these batshit fights are among FF16's highest merits. Ultima. this is where things get a little sticky. Ultima is the figure who created humanity, and through a series of unfortunate events, has come to be the central antagonist of the story. I think there's one interesting thing about Ultima, and it's saved until the very, very end. Ultima isn't responsible for the Blight, nor can they stop it. In fact, Ultima was fleeing the Blight when they originally came to Valisthea, or the parts of Valisthea we know. The Blight consequently gets shoved aside and hand-waved away before and during the credits. It's kind of a red herring, I guess, a big world-ending thing that one assumes was either a consequence of the Mother Crystals or Ultima, or maybe both. I think it's incredibly fascinating to have a villain with such power and mystery still sort of befuddled by this natural occurrence. Ultima didn't make the Blight. Ultima has no answer for the Blight. I suppose that's not entirely true. It's just that Ultima's answer is to kill all humans. Let me explain a bit. So Ultima is part of this larger collective of creatures that I think all look alike. They had a kind of hive mind thing going on somewhere else in the world. Maybe in space. I think the specifics are spelled out in a book that's only in Japanese and wikis, but the main narrative of the game doesn't go hard on this sort of lore. The Blight began, and their civilization fell apart. A handful of these Ultima people migrated to Valisthea and became the Mother Crystals somehow, and basically left one lone Ultima to shepherd mankind along a path to a new world. The plan was for man to eventually give birth to the Mythos, a vessel capable of harnessing the power of all the Eikons. Why? Well, to cast a spell, of course. Ultima wanted this huge source of ether so they could cast rays, classic Final Fantasy spell, and form up a new world for their former kinsmen to return to. A world that could be theirs, built up by the mindless slave race that they created specifically for this purpose. Of course, so much time passed that the mindless slaves eventually developed a culture, and more importantly, free will of their own. Frustration about mankind's defiance is also a motivational force for Ultima to get this show on the road and destroy Valisthea as we know it. It's a cosmic horror kind of twist on the classic JRPG villain, but at the same time, it's still a classic JRPG villain. There isn't a lot of interest to Ultima, and this whole plan to kill people and take land and resurrect an ancient race is kind of samey. What a sentence that is. Some of the specifics are interesting based on what I read on the wiki after finishing the game. But man, if you gotta reference a wiki to get all the details, that's not great storytelling. FF16 has a codex, hilariously referred to as active time lore, and it goes so far as to let you pause cutscenes and reference important characters and concepts that come up in said cutscenes. It's a really cool system, like having organized metadata for your role-playing game story, but I think there's a reliance on it that makes the writing overall come off weaker. As a tool to remember names or catch up after not playing the game for a few days, it's great. But the designers seem to have planted information in the active time lore that is just shy of necessary to understand what's going on. It's certainly needed to fully understand what's going on. That's not great, and I think this is where FF16 is at its absolute weakest. More than the side content, this expectation that you will stop your gameplay and read all this important information, especially when there are events actively playing out on screen, is a mistake. I don't want to do it, and I'm a story weirdo, so I know the average player isn't going to engage with this system much, if at all. Unfortunately for Ultima, they are kind of the face of this problem. It's the wider details of Valisthea and its history that tie into what Ultima is doing. Layer this onto a pretty cliche motivation for the villain, sprinkle in last-minute revelations and exposition, and whoo-wee, you got a stew going. A not very tasty stew, mind you. I wanted to like Ultima. I wanted to feel threatened by their impossibly large presence, their ability to integrate into human hosts or take on other shapes, makes them a real threat, but even this isn't utilized very much. Basically, Ultima gains control of Sanbreque by pretending to be the little Lord Fauntleroy, and its machinations essentially destroy the power structure of that nation. But it's primarily presented to us as the royal family having a drama. It's simultaneously interesting and rote. By the time it paid off, I was ready for that part of the story to be over. I guess it had outlived its interest. I think the idea was to craft a villain that felt as if they were manipulating everything from the shadows. But where a villain like that succeeds is in carefully letting the audience in on it. It takes the precision of a scalpel to do well, and it's no easy task. But Ultima isn't a scalpel. Ultima is a machete, coming in hard and rough and leaving all these jagged bits behind as it goes. I was rooting for Clive to win, which, hey, that's what they wanted me to do, but it was more for his sake than any inner motivation brought about by the threat Ultima posed to the world at large. I just wanted my boy to see his dreams through and make a new world for his friends. You know, anime shit. And ultimately, that's what I got. Clive defeats Ultima and the game ends. A mid-credit stinger reveals that the world survives the blight somehow, and that humanity is thriving some many years later. Clive's time has fallen into legend, the adventure being retold in the form of a book supposedly penned by Joshua. It's an ambiguous ending meant to show us that even though we may not know the fates of our central cast, we do know that they definitively won. Their quest succeeded. The day is saved. Final Fantasy XVI is, from a storytelling standpoint, a remixing of tropes and narrative patterns we have seen in Final Fantasy before. It's a new story, a new world, new characters, and some of this is defined better than it ever has been before. But it isn't all that different than Cecil's journey from confused Dark Knight into world-saving Paladin, or Lightning's original quest, or Cloud's, or Squall's. The differences are in what specifically happens, but the rhythm is very similar. You start at level 1, not very meaningful in the world. You end by killing a god. In this case, literally. Final Fantasy XVI does not stray from its predecessors nearly as much as the typical Forumite would lead you to believe. It's an action game, yes, but if it isn't a Final Fantasy, then I don't know what is. That comes with a lot of baggage and expectations, unfortunately. If you put out a game with a big numeral in the title, people are going to go in with preconceptions. Personally, I think this one caught more discourse bullets than it deserved to. For whatever reason, not being a turn-based JRPG got stuck in a lot of collective craws. Then, for the people who did play the game, the story changes from one grand thing into a separate grand thing. I went from thinking I had a great grip on what this game was and what it was about, only to realize that everything I understood was kind of just a prelude to a bigger, more archetypal story. The fact that FF16 ends up trotting well-worn ground does not erase what it accomplishes, however. Again, I cannot give enough praise to the general direction of cinematics, the quality of the score that underpins everything, and the powerful performances given by the voice cast. Despite its many flaws, Final Fantasy XVI is a phenomenal game and a phenomenal Final Fantasy. It may not be the best story in the industry, but Square Enix has continued to raise their own bar when it comes to getting the player invested in the worlds they create. In terms of narrative, I would not call this the best Final Fantasy, but I would certainly rank it among the best. This is credit due to the game's first section far more than the second, but still. Is Final Fantasy XVI worth playing? I think yeah, absolutely. I think it has a beautiful story about loss and recovery hidden like a needle in the story's bigger hay bale of information. But that story is so good and so well conveyed that even the lackluster final chapters cannot undercut its emotional weight. I've been thinking about the game for several days now, going over what I like and didn't like as if I were making a much more succinct and much less interesting video. FF16 is going to occupy some of my brain space for a while. That, to me, is a mark of a great video game. Also, it has the best line in series history in it.
The world you see is but a fantasy! The only fantasy here is yours. And we shall be its final witness.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking it or subscribing to the channel for more content like this. You'll probably also like my video about Dragon Age Origins, which is very focused on the story and narrative structure of that game as well. Peace.